Ever wake up from a dream that felt so real, so real, that it took you a little while to realize that it was you sleeping and that you had never left your bed? Like you had to look around the room to realize where you were. That sort of experience is very similar to what your true self experiences when it ends up leaving the human body for good. So upon taking your last breath and departing from this physical realm, it will take a few seconds for you to realize that the whole while you were just dreaming. And as I communicate to you now about this dream, it's being recorded by my true self, and it will be part of the experiential set that carries with me for eternity. Along those lines, the energy that I'm using to communicate, the style by which I communicate, certainly the intellect, many of the personality traits, much of that was chosen as part of the incarnation. So prior to arriving, the decision was made what the incarnation would focus on and what qualities your person would have to facilitate that journey. Would you be very smart? Would you be gregarious? Would you carry different types of adversity in the family space, for example? What experiences and personality traits would dictate the dream that was about to be had? And the best tool that we have to understand what qualities were chosen prior to incarnation is the astrological chart. And if you think of it in this context, which is energies that are chosen or adversity that was planned, areas of focus, you can think of your eternal self as a beam of light. And that beautiful white light is moving through a series of different stained glass windows. And each of those panes within the windows are angled a little bit differently, and they're carrying different shades, and they're constantly shifting around. And as your beam of light comes through all of those different panes of windows, it's collecting the necessary energy to make you who you are. Virtually all of the qualities that you experience within the human self are left behind when the human self is complete. There are, however, two fundamental qualities that remain with your spiritual self for eternity. And one of those qualities is the way you love. And so no matter how many astrological charts you pore over, or how much time you spend evaluating one's upbringing, you can't anticipate the way in which someone loves. And in this case, love is a bidirectional energy. It's both how you give and receive love, how you experience love. And that energy is remarkably unique, and it carries with you from one incarnation to actually all incarnations are feeding into a central source and constantly evolving the way in which you love. It's a quality that will be with you for eternity. It's a divine energy that is unique to each and every person. What's so beautiful about the way that you love is that every so often, you'll end up meeting another soul that has evolved in a way whereby the way that they love and the way that you love end up becoming beautifully, beautifully compatible. As if the lock and the key now perfectly match. And that is just a special moment because the uniqueness of how you love can only ever infrequently find someone else whose uniqueness in which they love is perfectly compatible for you. And that's the ever romantic notion of soulmates. It's two souls that have been journeying together and evolving through their loving ways who have discovered that they in fact are compatible. And as a result, they've chosen to incarnate together to continue to work on their love and to grow closer and closer. Soulmates can refer to close friends that incarnate together, but most people think of it in the context of a romantic partnership, a true soulmate. There are a few other points in this discussion that are worth approaching, and that is there are many, many incarnations that have no intention of focusing on finding a soulmate. They have other focuses. Could be career focus, it could be family focus, it could involve travel or academia, and different types of adversity like health adversity. Relationships are almost always baked into an incarnation, but relationships are not always the sole focus of an incarnation. And it's important for those who are constantly searching for their soulmate to realize that not every incarnation is intended of finding it. The second point that I'll make is that many incarnates have yet to evolve to a place where the way they love has found the matching vibration of the way another loves and can therefore form a perfect soulmate relationship. To put another way, the human self easily interferes with the way we love. And as a consequence, if we haven't moved past some of our low vibrational qualities of being human, we can't freely love. We can't step into our heart space completely to properly exhibit our most beautiful vibration, and therefore we're inhibiting our ability to connect on a soulful level with another. And so these relationships, because we still pursue relationships even when we're not fully ready for a soulmate relationship, these relationships would be regarded as karmic relationships. It's just a term to refer to a more adverse-based relationship, which will forever challenge both incarnates to grow, but may not have the same accentuation of love that perhaps they desire. And the way you know that you're potentially in a karmic relationship is that you spend most of your time asking, expecting, demanding that the other person change. Right? The vibration of acceptance is usually lacking. And in turn, the vibration of sometimes control or sometimes non-acceptance becomes more dominant. And so a typical karmic relationship has two incarnates that are just always looking or seeking that the other person should be somebody different or that they should change. Not to say that a soulmate relationship doesn't offer opportunities for growth, but in a soulmate relationship, it's supportive, loving, and accepting. And so the desire to grow together is the default. Whereas in a karmic relationship, it's a little bit more divided. And as a consequence, the relationship spends most of its time focusing on how the other person has to be different. The best indication for a woman that she's about to enter into a karmic marriage is she has cold feet. Leading into her wedding night, there is something in her that is saying this may not be the right choice. There are other indications as well that will pop up at different points in the relationship, and they're almost always vibrationally related, which is you can detect the presence of anger, right? You have a feeling of insecurity or guilt. These vibrations, which are resident within the individual, in the context of a karmic-based relationship, are usually deliberately accentuated, as if one is trying to provoke it out of the other. As that conversation was continuing, I thought it would be a lot easier if I could add some visuals to this discussion. And so I came up with a handful of slides, and I also wanted to show you how the astrology can work wonderfully to give you a sense of where your relationship is, and perhaps even the reason that you've come together. And so to continue with what I was saying just a moment earlier, We have karmic relationships on one end and soulmate relationships far on the other. And many relationships find themselves somewhere in between, where it is making progress and certainly evolving, but has yet to perhaps arrive at a purely connected soulmate relationship. And so if we look at this graphic, we can think of karmic relationships here on the left as oftentimes being me-based relationships. What do I receive? Are my needs being met? The focus by one, if not both members of the relationship, is the self. It's me. And within karmic relationships, it is primarily strongly focused on individual learnings and lessons. And a big part of those learnings and those lessons is both oftentimes the love and acceptance of others, but it's also the love and acceptance of self. When there's a predominance of me energy, there's almost always an element of self that you're not quite at peace with. And that shows itself most prominently when we're vulnerable in relationships. You'll also note the karmic relationships, because this concept, the desire that the other person changes, that's the non-acceptance energy, which usually leads to conflict that I was speaking of just a few moments earlier. It creates a great degree of volatility, and yet at the same time, there's usually an intense, almost inescapable attraction, whereby if the relationship ends, but the lessons haven't been learned, you find yourself right back in that relationship. I'll also make two more comments on karmic relationships, and that is that they tend to pull inward. You know that you're in a karmic relationship when over time, fewer friends or family members desire to keep your company as a couple. You become more insular, you become more isolated. And you'll also see here there's this concept of a karmic wheel. Many karmic relationships have been going on for many incarnations. And it requires one member to elevate their consciousness, make peace with all the adversity, all the hurt, all the disappointment, actively and fully step off that karmic wheel by deploying the overwhelming love, or the overwhelming energy of love and acceptance. Those are probably the two most dominant themes to disconnect from a karmic wheel. So if you're reflecting on a bad breakup or past relationship that disappointed you and you still have any low vibrational energy around it where you have disdain or anger or animosity towards that person, then energetically you're still attached to them. You're still on that wheel. It may require future incarnations to properly break it. From there, there's this huge group of relationships that are not purely karmic, but they also haven't evolved here to the soulmate, and I'm just calling them transitional relationships for convenience. This is a discussion that can go on forever. And so it's really just in the interest of time here. Keep in mind that many relationships, and I speak of marriage mostly, although they can be any long-term relationship, many relationships will fall into this space. And these relationships may not be the primary focus for the individual's incarnation, and so they're more than adequate for what they're seeking. And these relationships typically oscillate between good and bad periods. There is a desire present to work on the relationship and to grow. The dominant energy is we consciousness, which is to work together. So you're actively seeing yourself as a unit. And there is a degree of trust and communication, which typically strengthens over time. The conflict allows these energies to improve. In karmic relationships, trust and communication usually worsen over time. And then finally, these transitional relationships, there's still oftentimes a feeling that they're incomplete. There may be this pervasive energy that something just isn't as good as you feel it could be. And that is perfectly normal. And it may be very true. The final category here, which is all the way on the right-hand side, being soulmates, it's not to say that they don't have conflict, but rather it's to say that they grow through that conflict, and their desire is to continuously use conflict as opportunities to understand each other better, to pursue each other's needs, and to emerge stronger from that conflict. Acceptance and love and cooperative energy is the most dominant present energy. There's usually open and very strongly inclusive communication. The ability to really share virtually everything is present. And then these relationships, because love spills over, they're expansive. More people desire to be in the space of this couple is lovely to be around. They have a natural loving embrace that others can feel. The dominant energy here, which once again, it's quite rare, is you-based energy, which is a man saying to a woman, you're my focus, you're the most important thing to me, and the woman returning and saying, you are the most important thing to me. And I say it man to woman. I guess it doesn't have to be. It could be man to man or woman to woman. I'll be politically correct in this video. So here you have it. This is the spectrum. This is the nature of relationships from a spiritual lens. Your responsibility is really just to figure out where you fall and how you can move further to the right-hand side of this chart. I'm going to continue in this discussion, and I'll show you a few beautiful examples, actually, and I'll start to pull it together from the lens of an astrologer. So I'm going to use William and Mary as my example set. It's an unusual example. So keep in mind that charts rarely find such perfect harmony as these charts are going to find. And also keep in mind, in the astrological space, love and marriage, the desire to have children, and the desire to be part of a traditional family, those are all separate houses, which means that the likelihood that somebody will bring all those energies into your space is incredibly, incredibly rare. We have this idyllic impression, oftentimes portrayed in Hollywood, that you fall in love with somebody that you're overwhelmingly attracted to, and that leads to a deep, passionate love that evolves into marriage and then eventually leads to kids and family. From an astrological standpoint, to be successful in all those categories is very rare. So just keep that in mind. But here you can see that in William's chart, there's nothing present in the 7th house. And the 7th house would be marriage. And so where nothing is present, that means a neutral disposition to these events. That means that William would not natively been called into marriage, and he could easily get into his 30s or 40s or 50s. And if the right girl didn't wind up in his space, then he wouldn't just get married. It wouldn't be part of his composition. You can see here when we look at Mary's chart, although she has energy in the relationship, romantic space, marital space, there's nothing calling her into motherhood. And it's also, this is where sexual expression actually comes in, the 5th house. And then there's a wound, the energy of Chiron sitting in the home, which is the 4th house. That would usually speak to somebody who had a tumultuous upbringing, maybe a great deal of instability or conflict in the home. And so what happens when Mary meets William? Well, we get what's known as an overlay, where one chart becomes energetically compatible or linked to another chart. And in this case, what's very interesting is that Mary, who is on the outside, ends up bringing 2 very significant placements into William's 7th house. She actively brings William into a space where he sees himself as the husband. The sun sign would be the identity and how you see yourself. When the sun sign comes into the 7th house, by virtue of Mary coming into William's space, William now believes himself to be a husband. And on top of that, Mars is coming in as well. That's the masculine drive and determination. In the 7th house, it means a great deal of attention. It can bring a degree of intensity, even accidental, as if the way they communicate can be accidentally intense, like as if it's unintentionally confrontational, but it's really just more passion and masculine determination. And so here you take someone who's neutral to marriage, but when Mary's in his space, all of a sudden he thinks he's a husband and he's driven to be with her. You'll also notice that the 5th house I mentioned is the house of children. This is the desire to be a parent. Jupiterian energy is expansive. It almost always speaks to somewhere in your 30s, you're going to grow into a role. And so in the case of Jupiter coming to the 5th house, not only does William see himself, but he sees himself as a father as well when Mary's in his space. If we reverse those charts and put Mary on the inside and William on the outside, when William comes into Mary's space, he also brings the energy of identity into her marital home. Mary now sees herself as a wife. By virtue of William being present, her energy is carrying her into that state of mind. And on top of it, William is bringing the intellect, which is Mercury, is coming into the 7th house as well. When Mercury is in the 7th house, you have tremendous clarity with regards to your relationship. You can see clearly the direction that the marriage is moving in. You can see clearly whether or not the communication is healthy, the partner is honest. Right? Some people get into relationships and they reflect back years later thinking, wow, what was I really thinking? But in the case of Mercury in the 7th house, there's tremendous clarity. And the ability to articulate when things are offline is present. You'll also notice what's really quite beautiful here is that if you remember, Mary had this wound, which was an instability and an insecurity around matters of the home. But when William's in her space, Mary starts to feel her nurturing, more feminine energy becoming ever present. Almost as if now her heart is in the home and she can see herself as creating a family with William. If that wasn't enough, the Venusian energy, which is the way we love and also flirt and our playfulness from a romantic standpoint, that comes into the house of self-expression, which is the 5th house. It's also where you end up developing the desire to be a mother. It's the expression through the child, if you will. And so when Venus comes into the 5th house, William is bringing in a playful sexual energy into this chart, which basically makes them like teenagers, almost as if they're just always going to want to be intimate together, holding and caressing. And it's a particularly rare, beautiful placement where the relationship, even as the years goes by, remains sexually together and wonderfully connected. Okay, so I can tell you that this example, as it runs through on so many different levels, is incredibly rare, but it's the clearest example that I could find that speaks to soulmates, whereby two people come together and they have very different focuses in life until they find each other. And at that time, they begin to see themselves as husband and wife, as parents to children, as part of the same family, and so on and so forth. And this sort of energy will carry for a lifetime. They could have spent years and years discarding other relationships until they met each other, and that would be it. And I know this couple very well, and I can tell you that this is exactly what happened with them. They met and were inseparable, for the most part, inseparable from the moment they met, and years later, they found themselves in a beautiful family, spending most of their time together and inclusive of all others that desired to be in their space. They were drawing more and more people into their world based on their beautiful, loving vibration. And so this is what I have for you guys today. I hope you find it of value as always. And I wish you love and light and encourage you along your journey.